This is Module 2, Dual Identities of Student Athletes. In the first module, you had the opportunity to explore some identity theories. In this module, we will discuss in more detail some of those challenges for identity development in college students. So, in addition to the academic training that is expected for college students, it's also a time in their lives where psychosocial and identity development takes place. You learn from some of the theories that we explored, that some of the tasks and challenges that college students embark upon are learning to become autonomous, developing mature interpersonal relationships, exploring values and integrity, and establishing identity. For student athletes, the major culprits of their identity development are time and tradition. With time, because of the demands that athletic participation poses, there simply is not sufficient time for them to take on those tasks that are instrumental in their identity development. The second part of that is tradition. Student athletes have a very regimented way of being. They are very accustomed to the athletic culture and what that entails, both spoken and unspoken. A lot of the rules per se as it pertains to athletic conduct are socialized rules and things that you know and you learn about the way you are to conduct yourself based upon years and years of athletic participation. So there are certain social norms that occur in the athletic culture that at sometimes conflict with what they would expect in a collegiate environment, and that proposes developmental challenges for student athletes. So let's take these sort of one at a time. Let's start with time. NCAA Bylaw 17 is available from the Division I manual. NCAA Division I manual is available on Blackboard for you to review. But basically, the premise of this bylaw is to regulate participation rules and explain the limitations. Generally speaking, student athletes are limited to a maximum of 20 hours per week of athletically related activities, and no more than 4 hours a day during the competition season. When they're not in competition season, they are limited to a maximum of 8 hours a week. Now, that doesn't really sound like a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. This is pretty much what might be expected of someone who has a part-time job. And so oftentimes when you're talking about the time demands of student athletes, you'll hear, well, so what? There's plenty of college students that have to work and have other obligations. And what's the big deal with student athletes? Well, one thing to consider is that this 20 hours per week during competition time and the 8 hours per week during non-competition time only factors in countable athletic related activities. By definition, countable athletically related activities are activities that are at the discretion of or supervised by one or more of the institution's coaching staff. So these are your practices where the coach is present. This includes watching game film and other activities that are directed by, supervised by one or more of the institution's coaching staff. So there are a lot of things that are a part of a student athlete's day that is not necessarily considered a countable athletically related activity. For example, medical rehab is excluded. Your athletic trainer, let's say you have an injury or you have a certain medical need that requires day-to-day physical therapy, the athletic trainer is not considered someone on the institution's coaching staff. So that time that you may spend icing or getting taped up to prevent injuries, or time that you may spend actually rehabbing an actual injury is not included in that time. And sometimes that time it adds an extra hour onto the day. Individual practice and training is also excluded. So this is time that the athlete takes for his or herself to get better in their sport. There are certain things, for example, if you are a runner, let's say you run cross country, uh, it may be a part of your regimen to just get up and go for a run every morning before you go to class because it loosens your body up, it gets your body ready for the day. If you play football, for example, you might want to get up and do your weightlifting in the morning. If there is, if there isn't a coach present, that time that you take just for your own individual development and for the betterment of your sport is not included in that time, and that is considered voluntary athletic related activities. In order for something to not count that is athletically related and considered voluntary, these four factors have to be in place. There's no coach present. It has to be initiated by the athlete. That time and activities cannot be tracked and reported back to the coach, and there can be no penalty for failing to participate in this activity. So those types of activities are considered voluntary and, of course, do not count towards those countable athletically related activities. But I don't care what level of competition you play, Division 1, 2, or 3. If you're an athlete, you want to do your absolute best, and whatever time you need to put into practicing outside of those 20 hours, it may not necessarily be explicitly stated, but if you're, for example, trying to earn a starting position or keep your starting position on the team, that may require you to put in more work than the supervised practices that are with the coach. So just understanding that when we talk about this 20 hours a week, it's not like a typical part-time job where you clock in and clock out. There's going to be other elements of the day that also factor time, not just time in the physical sense, but also in the mental sense. You know, when you have to mentally prepare, that's thought time that you don't necessarily have to think about other activities that are instrumental in your development if the only type of development you're focused on is your athletic development. I want to introduce this word called valedictory. This is something that I became familiar with when I was a student athlete. Valedictory activities are optional but not optional. These are some of those voluntary athletically related activities that they say you shouldn't be penalized. But like I said, if you're trying to earn a spot as a starter or make the travel squad or some of those other things, these are things that, you know, are going to be evaluated whether it is explicitly stated or not. So the second piece of the puzzle that influences student athlete development in other areas other than sport is tradition. Generally speaking, student athletes are highly regimented. They work and operate on a schedule. They're used to balancing the demands, multiple demands. So sort of balancing the student-athlete dichotomy did not start in college. They had to do it when they were in high school. They had school all day, had to go to practice, had games and competitions in the evenings and the weekends. And so this is very much a part of who they are and probably has been a part of who they are for a very long time. They're also used to operating within rules and boundaries. So when we talk about learning to operate autonomously, when you've had someone that has been putting you on a schedule for a majority of your life, it's very difficult to operate outside of confined rules. Even in the sports they play, they have to memorize a book full of rules and regulations. You have to play within the boundaries of the playing surface. Student athletes and rules and limitations and boundaries are a part of what they normally do. They're also accustomed to following authority figures. And when you're trying to come into your own, sometimes, you know, that deference to authority figures isn't always the best way to navigate through identity development. And we talk about and we learned about states of foreclosures. Athletes are definitely at risk for foreclosure because they are most certainly used to not questioning authority. You don't question your coach. You don't question your workout. You don't question the direction that they have put out for your life, whether or not you start, how many minutes you get in a game, what competitions that you will enter in. They have very little say-so on that, and they often don't challenge it, even when things that are presented to them go against what they may personally believe. They are very accustomed to following authority figures. So one question to consider is, since some student athletes have been playing sports since they were adolescents, how does this culture of sport create potential barriers for their identity development? That's what I want you to think about as we go through this course, and this is what we will address in our symposium when we meet. So when these two identities collide, student athletes receive a lot of mixed messages on a day-to-day basis on whether or not they're a student or whether or not they're an athlete first. Everyone will say, you're here to get your education. You're here to be a student. But at the same time, there are certain practices that are in place that very much so make athletics the priority. So we have these two domains. In the student domain, the academic eligibility process is very intricate and it contains a lot of rules. There are a lot of regulations that will guide student athletes' academic eligibility. You have to have so many credits. You have to progress at a certain rate in order to be academically eligible. You have to have certain scores. And so the eligibility process is designed to make sure that students that are not meeting the academic obligations are prohibited from participating in sport. Another example of how the student domain is emphasized is that student athletes are required to take a full load of classes to be eligible. It doesn't matter if they only want to take 9 hours this semester because that's all they feel that they can handle and they want to really concentrate on a very difficult class, or just like, a regular student or a non-athlete peer, as we would say, can determine how many courses they want to take and whether or not they want to sit out a semester and come back next semester, whether or not they want to take summer school or not. A lot of times this is very much articulated and dictated. The course loads are set in stone, and oftentimes student athletes are required, unless they are in their last season of eligibility, to take a full load of classes. Academic advisors specifically exist for athletics, so they have hired personnel that is their job is strictly to make sure that student athletes' academic needs are met. That's another way the student domain is prioritized. And student athletes often have mandatory tutoring and study hall. Again, understanding that their time is very limited. Oftentimes what teams and coaches will do is factor in the time that they're supposed to be studying and proactively get them extra help on certain subjects so that they don't find themselves in a situation where they're needing help later. But on the other side of the coin, there's the athlete domain that is emphasized. And here are some examples that I've listed with the athlete domain is definitely prioritized over the student domain. And that's one fact is coaches get hired and fired based on teams' athletic performance, bottom line and period. If a coach is not winning, the coach will not be retained in most cases. It doesn't matter how well that individual is producing good citizens and people and athletes of good character. That stuff is definitely praised and lauded, but that doesn't necessarily keep you a job if you haven't won a game all season. Also, the athlete domain is emphasized because certain majors and classes and class options are restricted if they don't fit into the athletic schedule. So unless, you receive special permission from a coach, most of the time student athletes are prohibited from scheduling classes during a certain block of time. Missed class for athletic events are generally considered excused absences, but missed practice for co-curricular events are not typically allowed. So if there is the NCAA basketball tournament and your team makes it. A lot of times those games are on weekdays and classes may be in session. Because they're representing the university, it's usually acceptable for the student athlete to request an excused absence, to not be penalized for their absence as long as they make up the work and made arrangements to make up any work that is missed. But for co-curricular events, for example, if there's something cool going on at the Student Center, or there is a program or an event that the counseling center is putting on that could be for their benefit, or if the Greek system is having their rush, you can't necessarily go to your coach and say, hey, I need off for practice because I want to attend this program that the Multicultural Center is having on that day. So these two identities collide often. There are a lot of mixed messages on what should be their priority. And when these identities collide, it definitely has implications for the student athletes' being. There's a study, and I posted the study on Blackboard as well, and this notion of you are who we say you are, and why in the student affairs profession, I believe it's very important that we proactively find ways to engage student athlete populations, as well as any other population of students that may face barriers to their development while in college. This study that I put, I'm not going to pretend I know how to pronounce that. I'm guessing it's EDUC and Prentice. We're going to say EDUC, and hopefully I'm right. But anyway, they did a study on identity salience and stereotypes. And what they found is that students, when primed with a certain identity, will perform based on that identity. So in this study, the students were assigned were prepped with either a student identity, an athletic identity, or no identity. And the students that were primed with their athletic identity performed lower on a math test than those that were primed with their student identity. So what do these findings suggest? What it says is that we have, as student affairs practitioners, as those that are intervening and ushering students on their identity development journey, we have a lot to say. The way we talk to them, the way we treat them, the way we approach their development could have dramatic impacts on how they see themselves and how they prioritize those competing forces that occur in their life as they attempt to work through and navigate their identity development. So to continue on with this, there's a couple of things that you can do. I did put those, if you want to read them, the Watt and Moore article and the EDUC and Prentice study. They're both up on Blackboard for you to review. I also put the NCAA participation limits there so you can actually read the legislation as it pertains to student athlete time. This will be helpful for you when we have our seminar in June. The graded assignment for this week, I posted a video. Richard Sherman had made, he's a cornerback for the Seattle Seahawks. And during a press conference, he was asked to comment on whether or not student athletes take advantage of the quote unquote free education that they receive. And his response was very riveting, and it spoke very much to the day in the life of a student athlete and how they just don't get to take advantage of all that college has to offer. What I want you to do is comment on that. There's some guiding questions on the discussion board. Your first post should be by Wednesday evening, because what I want you to do is read your classmates' posts and also write a reaction to things that your classmates said. So if everyone can kind of get their responses up by Wednesday, that'll allow enough time for everybody to read them over and to respond. But essentially, your posts and reactions are all due by Saturday evening at 8 p.m. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and I look forward to reading your discussion on this week's topic, the dual identity of student athletes.